There were many reform movements in antebellum America, but without question, the movement that superseded all others in size and commitment was the abolition of slavery. Many reformers who originally committed themselves perhaps to temperance or female suffrage also took up abolitionism, and often put aside their first cause for the greater cause of advocating for the abolition of slavery in the United States. Abolitionism started as a small fringe movement. Often its supporters were considered radicals and intemperate, reckless and violent, but the moral fervor of the cause attracted greater numbers to the cause and was at the center of the division that would split the nation in 1860 and plunge the nation into war. Despite its ancient roots and widespread use in ancient and medieval history, many European nations had moved away from slavery, whether from moral principle or its expense. The Enlightenment led to the abolition of slavery in many European colonies by the beginning of the 19th century. Slavery in the form of serfdom still prevailed in some Eastern European states, particularly Russia. It was practiced in Asia and large sections of Africa. Slavery was declining but still prevalent in South America. The United States was the largest industrialized and modern nation, however, that still practiced slavery into the second half of the 19th century. The brutality of the institution outraged reformers all over the world, and pictures like this one galvanized those who would otherwise look the other way from the institution. This photo is of a slave named Peter from Mississippi, who was so brutally whipped that his back was heavily lacerated. The photograph was broadly circulated among abolitionists, and similar accounts and depictions brought the moral horror of slavery to an abundance of reformers. As a legacy of the large plantations that were built during the colonial period, slavery was prevalent primarily in the American South. Northern climates were not as disposed towards large-scale agriculture, and thus northern colonies and then states early on abolished slavery, primarily because of its lack of necessity. The mills and factories that sprang up across the North rather were employed with tens of thousands of European immigrants who worked in miserable conditions for a low wage. The South would call such factory projects in the North wage slavery, little different from Southern slavery. There were about 1 million slaves in the nation upon the ratification of the Constitution. Some believe the institution was about to decline and die out, but the discovery of cotton as an abundant and lucrative crop that could be refined by the cotton gin very quickly augmented the need for larger plantations, more help in the fields, and therefore more slave labor. There is a direct relationship between the expansion of cotton growing in the South and the increase in slavery. By the time of the American Civil War, 4,000 slaves resided in the American South. The Deep South became known as the Black Belt, particularly for its dark, rich, and fertile soil that was ideal for cotton production. Tens of thousands of acres were converted to cotton production. Cotton was easy to grow. It was abundant. It was durable. It wore with great comfort, able to simultaneously keep its user warm while also it was able to breathe during warmer days. It was profitable. The only need was for it to be picked and then refined. Long staple cotton was particularly in demand as it was ideal for making a variety of textiles and other goods. Its value was known for a long time, but the sticky seeds embedded in the strands of the cotton required a very labor-intensive process to remove the seeds by hand, yielding just a few pounds of cotton per day. The cost was not worth it. Eli Whitney's cotton gin revolutionized and nearly automated the process. Now, a single slave using a cotton gin could generate a few hundred pounds of cotton each day to be sold at market. Whereas tobacco had been the cash crop in the colonial era, cotton now became the most abundant and lucrative crop grown in the American South. Southerners even referred to it as King Cotton. It nearly drove the entirety of the Southern American economy. Cotton growers and traders saw such profits in the crop that the American South became a unitary economy and lacked the industrial and manufacturing diversity of the North. Britain and France may not have endorsed the slave system that generated American cotton, but they did appreciate the low price of the crop and purchased it in abundance to be refined by their own textile mills. Northern textiles, even more so, traded manufactured products for Southern cotton, and sent it immediately to its own textile mills. Thus, even as much of the North was condemning the Southern practice of slavery, the entire nation was profiting from and enjoying the benefits of cotton textiles that were heavily dependent on slave labor. The plantation was the largest privately owned economic unit and the venue where the most slaves were located. The Southern plantation bore some resemblance to the medieval manor. Not entirely self-sufficient, but besides its cotton exports, it did emphasize its internal structure and endeavor to confine its occupants to its locality. Very large plantations were not numerous in the antebellum South, but a number of them were established with wealthy families who owned and operated very large plantations and included several hundreds in residence. A large manor house was the largest building and the home of the owner and his family and domestic servants. Additional small dwellings may have also been located on the plantation, a home for the overseer, guest housing, and more housing for free laborers. A barn, a stable, a smokehouse, and a warehouse were also commonplace on a large plantation. On the far end of the plantation would be located the slave cabins, dilapidated structures far removed from the wealth of the plantation owner's existence. Several different crops may be farmed on the plantation, including rice, indigo, hemp, grains, fruits, and vegetables, but cotton usually occupied the most acreage. The antebellum South was run by the Southern aristocracy. These were families with extended roots back into the colonial generation. Generations of wealth had purchased more land, expanded the plantation, built the large house, and moved in with national and international trade networks. Politicians in the South came from this class. Members of the upper class would be the strongest supporters of maintaining slavery and eventually secession. They would have the most to win with disunion, but also the most to lose. It is important to remember that wealthy plantation slave owners were a very small percentage of the antebellum South. Wealthy elites who owned 10 or more slaves probably represented less than 7% of the Southern population. Those with a handful of slaves was no more than 20%. Approximately 3/4 of white Southerners were not slave owners at all. They most likely supported the institution and likely supported secession, even though they were not participating in the great wealth that slavery brought to the American South. The vast majority of white Southerners were yeoman farmers. Yeoman farmers were independent landowners who probably resented the large plantation owners. Yeoman farmers only owned perhaps a few dozen acres or less. They worked the land themselves, got their hands dirty, and had large families in order to have more hands to help on the family farm. Perhaps they owned one or a few slaves, but the cost of purchasing and maintaining a slave put heavy burdens on the yeoman's farm. Thus, many yeoman farmers supported the institution of slavery, even though their cut of the profits was less than that of the Southern aristocracy. As an overwhelmingly agricultural society in an emerging industrial age, the American South was characterized by an abundance of poverty. Scores of poor whites owned little to no land and struggled to get by and feed their families. They certainly did not feel adequately represented by Southern elites, but much of the propaganda supporting slavery was directed towards them, and poor whites would be conscripted in large numbers to fight for the Confederacy. A final distinct group in the antebellum South were folks that lived in the Southern Appalachians. So-called hillbillies were mountain folk who owned no slaves, little to no land, and formed a distinct poor mountain culture that vastly differed from the plantation lives of the Southern aristocracy. While no advocates of racial equality, hillbillies did not have the economic stake invested in slavery that the aristocracy did. Few of them supported secession from the Union. They bitterly resented the commercial and agricultural elites of the tidewater areas of the South. Their world was a different one. They saw themselves less as Southerners than many others did in their region. There were many free Negroes in the antebellum era who did not live the entirety of their lives in slavery. Perhaps they had never lived in slavery, particularly if they were born in a northern state. Although Richard Allen was born into slavery in Delaware, Allen taught himself to read and write and converted to Methodism. When his master released him, Allen eventually founded the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME, in Philadelphia, where he became an advocate for black Americans, both slave and free. Jean-Baptiste Pont de Sable was a free black who lived in the North and is credited with establishing the trading settlement that would eventually become the city of Chicago. Sojourner Truth was born in slavery, but escaped in 1826 and became an activist for African American civil rights, women's rights, and temperance. Her most famous speech addressing the rights of women was entitled, "Ain't I a Woman?" Solomon Northup was a free Negro who lived in New York, owned property, and conducted business. On a trip to Washington, D.C., where slavery was legal, Northup was drugged and kidnapped and brought to the South and put into slavery for the first time in his life. For 12 years, he was a slave in Louisiana until the governor of New York secured his release. Prince Hall was a leader of the free black community in Boston, an abolitionist and the founder of Prince Hall Freemasonry, an elite association that was open to free blacks in the North. Phyllis Wheatley was born in West Africa and came to North America as a slave, but after learning to read and write, she composed what is considered to be the first published volume of poetry composed by an African American author. Her masters were so impressed by her talent that they emancipated her. Free blacks in the North, however, were vastly outnumbered by enslaved blacks living in the South, living in bondage. Slavery was such a defining experience for early African Americans that it's important to consider it in some detail and then the movement of abolitionism to secure its termination. In the first 150 years of the African slave trade, West Central Africa supplied 9 out of 10 African people destined for a life of slavery in the Americas. Except for a 50-year period between 1676 and 1725, West Central Africa sent more slaves to the Americas than any other region. In the first century of trading, over 900,000, 52% of all Africans living on the continent, came from West Central Africa. Africans were often first enslaved by other Africans. Tribal warfare on the continent often led to prisoners within local conflicts that were made slaves by the victorious tribe. The interior of Africa was rife with slavery well into the 19th century, and then into the 20th century at the very least in the form of child soldiers. Enslaved Africans may have labored for a time for their captors in the interior of Africa, but more profit could be made if slaves were brought to the West Coast and then sold to a European slave trader. Once a European trader, frequently Spanish or Portuguese, had purchased a group of slaves, the bound Africans were loaded onto a ship for the transatlantic crossing. The transatlantic crossing of African slaves to the Americas was known as the Middle Passage, as the passage across the Atlantic was in the middle between the Old World and the New World. It was one of the most horrid and brutalizing experiences in world history. Enslaved Africans were densely packed and overcrowded into the stinking hulls of slave ships with little ventilation, no bathroom facilities, barely any food, no health care, and little chance of survival. The squalid conditions led to high death rates among otherwise healthy human beings. There was no room to move, little to breathe, and the stench and filth of too many humans packed together for the months-long journey across the Atlantic. Besides the wretched conditions, slaves were subject to unrelenting punishment, including lashings and torture. Slaves who protested were particularly targeted for punishment or even execution. Some women were raped. Children were given no special attention. Neither were the aged or infirm. The sick, the dying, and the dead were simply thrown overboard in the middle of the Atlantic to drown. If the ship was simply overloaded, more were thrown overboard as well. Those that survived the brutal Middle Passage were then subjected to the humiliation of a slave market in the New World. Persons of wealth would gather for an auction of recently arrived Africans and then place bids on desired human beings. Husbands and wives were separated. Parents were separated from children. Most were stripped naked to be gawked at and examined. Male slaves with multiple laceration scars on their backs may indicate an obstinate slave that was considered a risk for a buyer. African males with young, strong bodies without signs of disease or injury were most desired. Young, healthy African women may have been selected for their reproductive capabilities or to satisfy the sexual demands of the buyer. No regard was given to the dignity or individuality of the slave. Once purchased by an American owner, slaves were sent throughout the American South to work in bondage, most likely for the remainder of their lives. There was little chance of them ever being reunited with family members. Many purchase, trade, and sale records were lost and non-existent. Slaves mostly worked in agricultural labor, frequently picking cotton and then removing the sticky seeds with a cotton gin. Slaves worked 6 long days each week. Almost no time was left for leisure or rest. Few slaves were taught to read and write. Taskmasters and field supervisors usually stood over them throughout the day with a whip or firearm to guarantee obedience and consistent labor. Slaves who were deemed obstinate or rebellious were often led to the brutality of the slave breaker. A slave breaker was specifically assigned to break the will and the bodies of slaves who talked back, broke tools, were considered lazy, or, worst of all, had attempted to escape and form a rebellion. Slave breakers were often sadistic in their punishments and callous to the pain they were inflicting. They represented some of the greatest horrors of the entire slave institution. Some older slaves and many female slaves may have been selected by a wealthy plantation owner to be removed from the fields and to work as domestic slaves inside the master's plantation house. Only very wealthy white Southerners could afford to purchase domestic slaves. For some, mammies, as older domestic slaves might be called, living in the plantation house may have been an improvement from field work. Some mammies were involved in raising and tending to the children of the master. Yet life in the plantation house for many female slaves could also be worse than field work. Isolation and confinement in the plantation house could make them vulnerable to the sexual violence of the plantation owner or his family or staff. Not a few black domestic slaves were raped by white owners. Children that may result from such rapes were usually not acknowledged or cared for by the master. Such rapes could go on for years, kept as a secret from the master's wife and family. Rape of domestic slaves only added to the horror of the institution as well. African slaves brought mostly tribal religions and traditions with them in the New World, perhaps animism from Africa or voodoo from Haiti. By 1800, few slaves living in the United States were Christians. The Second Great Awakening, however, led to widespread conversion of slaves to Christianity. White masters actually encouraged conversion, believing Christianity would promote compliance and obedience among slaves. Often a simple wood structure would be converted on a large plantation for a church for slaves. Under the watchful eyes of white owners, slaves participated in church services and Bible instruction. Many Negro spirituals, songs sung by slaves, would be composed in the fields and in the churches of African American slave churches. The same spirituals that spoke of deliverance, freedom, a promised land, and a new Jerusalem hid the double meaning of freedom from slavery as well as freedom in heaven. The effort of abolitionists to abolish American slavery underwent a multitude of stages with several approaches deemed best to purge the nation of the blight of slavery. Early in the Antebellum period, some advocated for colonization. The American Colonization Society was formed in 1816 to promote the return of slaves to Africa, believing there could be no world in which blacks and whites could live together in harmony, especially if the slave was set free. The American Colonization Society attracted some notable supporters, including Abraham Lincoln. A colony for former African American slaves was founded on the west coast of Africa, known as Liberia, a land of liberty. Its capital of Monrovia was named after the American president James Monroe. But the feasibility of deporting and recolonizing 1 million or more slaves back to Africa was never practical or very popular. Early on, some advocated for moral persuasion to promote emancipation, believing that convincing the Southern slave owners of the moral horror of slavery would be the most effective for achieving manumission. The effort, however, achieved little traction. Others advocated for a gradual manumission of freeing slaves, so that it was done over time, perhaps when a slave turned 18, 25, or an older age. This idea, too, gained little traction. Abolitionism started as just another reform movement among many near the time of the ratification of the Constitution. But over time, the effort to promote emancipation became much more popular and consuming to Northern reformers. Abolitionists were originally deemed radical for their radical demands that slaves be immediately manumitted. No more waiting, no more debate, no more stalling. Southerners were horrified by their demands and worried that intense abolitionists would stir up radicalism in the South. In the end, many abolitionists saw violence as the only means to rip the institution of slavery out of the hands of Southerners. Violent slave insurrections were encouraged, supported, and celebrated in the North, much to the horror of the South. In the end, it was the Civil War that violently rent the nation over the issue of slavery and eventually led to the manumission of 4 million slaves. One of the first notable abolitionists was Elijah P. Lovejoy. Lovejoy was a Presbyterian minister, journalist, newspaper editor, and fervent abolitionist. Lovejoy was born in New England and started a teaching career, but decided to go west and take up journalism. He founded the St. Louis Observer and made the newspaper increasingly critical of slavery. Facing increased attacks from a pro-slave force in Missouri, Lovejoy moved across the Mississippi River to Illinois, a free state. Lovejoy's growing critiques of slavery only inflamed local pro-slavery forces. His printing press was attacked multiple times, sometimes broken up, and thrown into the Mississippi River. Lovejoy obtained a fourth printing press and was storing it in a warehouse in November of 1837. When pro-slavery forces learned of the location of the printing press, they attacked the warehouse and fired shots at those inside. Lovejoy and his workers fired back and struck one man in the crowd. When Lovejoy believed the attackers had dispersed, he opened the front door to the warehouse. Immediately, he was struck by 5 shots and fell dead. Lovejoy's death became a lightning rod for the anti-slave movement. The murder highlighted the violence of slavery and those who were willing to defend the institution. It was a galvanizing event for both John Brown and Abraham Lincoln, and thousands in the North quickly joined anti-slavery societies. The abolitionist movement had its first martyr. Sarah Grimke and Angelina Grimke were the first nationally known white American female advocates for both women's rights and the abolition of slavery. What made them particularly unique was their Southern heritage did not prevent them from speaking out against slavery. They were born in South Carolina, but traveled and spoke extensively around the country regarding women's rights and slavery. Sarah Grimke's pamphlet, The Equality of the Sexes and the Condition of Women, represented the first serious discussion of women's rights by an American woman. The Grimke sisters were 2 of the few that advocated not only for the abolition of slavery, but also the guarantee of civil rights for African Americans. Perhaps the greatest lightning rod for the abolitionist movement in antebellum America was William Lloyd Garrison. Despised in the South and often shunned in the North, Garrison represented a new generation of fervent abolitionists who dedicated their lives and careers to the cause and would not rest until they saw to the extinction of slavery. Garrison was born in Newburyport, Massachusetts, and in order to help provide for his family, he took a young interest in journalism and newspapers. Garrison became a typesetter in Newburyport and eventually acquired control of the local newspaper. In the 1820s, he became involved in the anti-slavery movement, but rejected the gradualist arguments of those particularly in the American Colonization Society. Garrison became one of the founders of the American Anti-Slavery Society that reflected his immediatist views, calling for the immediate emancipation of all slaves in the nation without any compensation whatsoever for slaveholders. Garrison was determined to recast the abolitionist movement in more stark and immediate terms. He founded the newspaper called The Liberator to achieve such ends. The Liberator weekly newspaper was founded by William Lloyd Garrison and his friend Isaac Knapp in 1831. The very first issue outlined Garrison's mission for starting the paper and was one of the most direct statements ever written directly against slavery. Garrison wrote, "I am aware that many object to the severity of my language, but is there not cause for severity? I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. On this subject, I do not wish to think or to speak or write with moderation. No. Tell a man whose house is on fire to give a moderate alarm. Tell him to moderately rescue his wife from the hands of the ravisher. Tell the mother to gradually extricate her babe from the fire into which it has fallen. But urge me not to use moderation in a cause like the present. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch. And I will be heard. The apathy of the people is enough to make every statue leap from its pedestal and to hasten the resurrection of the dead." The circulation of the Liberator was limited, but it stoked fear in the South regarding slave insurrection, and that Garrison's fervency would only inflame more opposition to slavery in the North. Theodore Dwight Weld was likewise a New Englander and prominent opponent to slavery. Weld was a key figure in the founding of the abolitionist movement and was a very capable writer, editor, speaker, and organizer. Weld was well educated and well traveled, including in the American South, where he witnessed personally the institution of slavery. Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator, turned him into a committed abolitionist. In 1838, he married Angelina Grimke, who bore him 3 children. Weld's most notable and powerful work was American Slavery as It Is, Testimony of 1,000 Witnesses. The Grimke sisters helped him write and publish the work in 1839. The book was based on the first-hand accounts of escaped slaves and detailed the horrors of the institution. Its primary source material and gripping, compelling accounts brought at least Northerners face to face with the evils of American slavery. The book sold 100,000 copies and effectively garnered more support for the abolitionist movement. So determined and focused were his efforts to free the American slaves, Wendell Phillips was often considered the preeminent figure in the abolitionist crusade. Phillips was a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School. He quit his law practice in order to focus on the anti-slavery crusade. Wendell Phillips was considered to be devoid of racial prejudice even by African Americans. He was an early advocate for racial equality. He was also an early advocate for Native American citizenship. His oratorical skills were an immense asset to the abolitionist cause. 2 other prominent voices of the abolitionist crusade were the Tappan brothers. Lewis Tappan was born in Northampton, Massachusetts, and later moved to New York. Reading of the crusade of William Wilberforce to abolish slavery in the British Empire, Lewis Tappan decided to champion the same cause in the United States. Tappan coordinated public support in the North for the slaves of the Amistad and recruited the best lawyers to advocate for the slaves during their trial before the Supreme Court. Arthur Tappan was a successful businessman, but he never saw business as his prime endeavor in life. As a devout Calvinist and Congregationalist, Arthur Tappan believed in the emancipation of the slave and the evangelization of Africa. Along with William Lloyd Garrison and others, the Tappan brothers helped form the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1831. The American Anti-Slavery Society, formed in 1831, was the most influential organization in antebellum America seeking to abolish slavery. Although founded by a small group that included William Lloyd Garrison and the Tappan brothers, the group came to include as members some of the most prominent anti-slavery activists in the nation. The society included among its members Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Theodore Dwight Weld, James G. Birney, Lucretia Mott, Wendell Phillips, Lucy Stone, and John Greenleaf Whittier. The society gave voice to former slaves and published several works that highlighted the evils of slavery and advocated for its abolition. It was considered in the South to be one of the most radical and divisive organizations in the nation. One of the most prominent individuals to regularly speak at the American Anti-Slavery Society was the former slave Frederick Douglass. Without question, Douglass was the most important leader of the movement for African American civil rights in the 19th century. Douglass was probably born in 1818 in Talbot County, Maryland, on the eastern shore of Chesapeake Bay. His father may have been his mother's white master, but Douglass never knew for sure, as he was separated from his mother in infancy and raised by his grandmother. He taught himself to read and write so proficiently that later in life, his critics would doubt he had ever been in slavery. Douglass grew to be a large and strong slave, but also with a trace of defiance. A slave breaker once endeavored to break the defiant Douglass, but in the physical confrontation that ensued, Douglass bested the slave breaker. His master thereafter never tried to beat him again. Douglass managed to escape slavery in 1838 by jumping onto a train that was headed north. He arrived in New York and married in the same year. Douglass converted to Christianity and regularly criticized churches and pastors that supported slavery, which he called the greatest of moral evils. Although Douglass wrote 3 autobiographies over the course of his life, his most famous was Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, which was published in 1845. The book was an immediate bestseller and sold well over 11,000 copies. The narrative detailed Douglass's life in slavery, highlighting the inhumanity of the institution, and served as an engaging account of why the slaves needed to be emancipated. For the rest of his life, Douglass advocated for civil rights for Black Americans. Another significant abolitionist leader during the antebellum period was David Walker. Walker's father died before he was born, and because his mother was a free Negro, then David Walker was born free. Nevertheless, he empathized with the plight of enslaved blacks in the South and became a fierce anti-slavery advocate. Walker's publication, An Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, published in 1829, was unique in not just calling for the abolition of slavery, but also calling for racial equality. Many abolitionists may have fervently supported an end to slavery, but few were willing to go as far as Walker was regarding black civil rights. Walker called for an abolition of prejudice in all forms in American society. He rejected the assumption of the American Colonization Society that blacks and whites could not live together in the United States. He was an early voice in the call for the equal treatment of the races. Inherent to the institution of slavery was the desire to be free, and as a result, slaves often rebelled against their owners, endeavoring to overturn their oppression. Slave rebellion could occur in isolated incidents in which a single slave refused to work, broke tools, or damaged crops in an act of indirect rebellion, or a slave may be himself, or in collaboration with others, resort to violence against their masters and endeavor to topple the entire institution. It was rare that slave rebellions were successful, as slaves were usually outnumbered and outgunned. But the threat alone of rebellion injected fear into owners and masters that secretly and suddenly their slaves would rise up against them and use violence to protest their condition. There were numerous small rebellions since the beginnings of American slavery, but there were also several larger and significant revolts. The largest slave revolt in the South during the colonial period was the Stono Rebellion. It is also sometimes called Cato's Rebellion or Cato's Conspiracy after its leader. Centered in South Carolina, the Stono Rebellion was an effort by an enslaved African named Cato to march south with 20 other slaves to find their freedom in Spanish Florida. The group swelled to 60 slaves altogether, and along the way, the group killed 20 whites. The rebellion was put down, however, by the South Carolina militia and resulted in the deaths of 35 to 50 Africans. The first planned slave rebellion during the antebellum period was known as Gabriel's Rebellion. The rebellion was planned by an enslaved blacksmith named Gabriel living in Virginia, but it was never actually executed. Gathering a few dozen slaves with him, Gabriel fashioned swords out of scythe blades and also made musket balls and spears. The plan was to march into Richmond and seized control of the Virginia State Armory and the Virginia State Capitol. The slaves hoped to hold Virginia's governor as hostage in order to negotiate for their freedom. The revolt was never launched, however. Some of the slaves that knew of the plan informed their masters. The Virginia militia was called out, and gradually those involved in the planned revolt were arrested. Gabriel and over 25 others were tried and executed for the planned revolt. A series of new laws passed by the Virginia legislature restricted the movement and abilities of slaves even more to prevent additional plots. Another attempt at slave rebellion occurred in 1822. In that year, a free black man and community leader named Denmark Vesey planned a major revolt. Denmark Vesey was born into slavery on the island of St. Thomas, but he managed to purchase his freedom around the age of 32 after he was brought to Charleston, South Carolina. Vesey worked as a carpenter and helped to found the second largest African Methodist Episcopal congregation in the country. Eventually, the congregation grew in size to almost 2,000 members. A plot was uncovered in 1822 in which Vesey allegedly planned to kill slaveholders in Charleston, liberate local slaves, and then sail to the Republic of Haiti for freedom. Vesey and dozens of other slaves were accused of plotting slave rebellion, tried, and convicted. Vesey was executed by hanging on July 2, 1822. It is unclear whether or not Vesey actually was plotting rebellion, but his trial and hanging with many other slaves reveals the danger of even being associated with slave revolt. The largest slave-led revolt that actually was launched during the antebellum period was Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831. Nat Turner was born into slavery in 1800 in Southampton County, Virginia. He learned how to read and write and demonstrated a sharp natural intelligence. Turner was also very religious and believed he had a gift for prophecy and interpreting prophecies. After a series of visions, Turner came to believe God had placed a call on his life to free the slaves. On August 21, 1831, Turner launched a 4-day rebellion against white masters and landowners. Slaves in Virginia descended on the local whites with tools and scythes and killed 55 white men, women, and children. The state militia was quickly summoned and suppressed the slave revolt, killing 30 to 120 local blacks in the process. Nat Turner initially evaded capture but remained hidden in Southampton County. Turner was eventually captured and tried for insurrection. He was hanged on November 11, 1831. The large-scale violence of Nat Turner's rebellion confirmed the worst fears of slave owners. Additional laws were passed in Virginia to prevent such revolts. It was clear that as the antebellum period progressed, slaves were becoming more daring and more violent in their determination to secure their freedom. A small-scale slave revolt that was successful during the antebellum period was the Amistad Revolt. The Amistad was a 2-masted schooner ship that was transporting African slaves between Havana, Cuba, and Camagüey, Cuba. 3 days into the journey, the shackled slaves took control of the ship, killing the captain and the cook in the process. The Amistad sailed towards the United States, and its occupants were seized by a U.S. Customs ship. The fate of the Africans, their ownership, freedom, and future, was taken up by American courts, especially by the United States Supreme Court itself. In United States versus the Amistad, Supreme Court case of 1841, the nation's highest court ruled on behalf of the slaves, restoring their freedom. The Amistad case, their revolt, and their hard-won freedom became a symbol for the abolitionist movement in the United States. Besides outright rebellion, some American slaves also endeavored to escape their bondage through the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was not really underground or really a railroad. It was a system of secret routes and safe houses that slaves developed and expanded to escape slavery in the South and make it to the free North or Canada. Guides were known as conductors, and escaping slaves were referred to as passengers. The use and expansion of the system was facilitated by free African Americans, some Northern whites, as well as abolitionists. Some of the earliest routes of the Underground Railroad headed south to Spanish Florida, and then perhaps to Mexico or perhaps a Caribbean island. Routes that developed in the later antebellum period headed north in an effort to get across the Mason-Dixon line or the Ohio River. Fearing capture by slave catchers in the north and then being sent back to the south in slavery, many slaves continued all the way to Canada to be certain of their escape and freedom. It is impossible to know exactly how many slaves escaped following a route of the Underground Railroad, but estimates are as high as 100,000 slaves used the Underground Railroad to secure their freedom. The journey was very perilous and extremely risky. If caught, slaves would have their families broken apart. They would be severely punished and then reassigned to work under closer guard. The success of escaped slaves was incumbent on reaching safe houses, or so-called depots, where they could sleep and eat before continuing on in their journey. Springboro, Ohio is one example of a community that operated as a safe haven for travelers on the Underground Railroad. Local barns, cellars, attics, and other hiding spots were developed to hide slaves and give them shelter before they continued north. Crawl spaces and secret compartments in homes were repurposed for hiding slaves. Knowledge of such depots or safe houses were transmitted among the escaping slaves under the utmost secrecy. Forests, caves, swamps, and secret tunnels also moved slaves north or hid them from local slave catchers. The most notable conductor on the Underground Railroad was a former slave herself, Harriet Tubman. Born into slavery in Maryland, Tubman was beaten and whipped by her enslavers even as a child. A head wound caused by her enslaver caused her headaches and dizziness throughout her life. She was deeply religious and believed she had visions and dreams from God, inspiring her to help her free her people. Although Tubman escaped to Philadelphia in 1849, she returned to Maryland to rescue her family shortly after. She thereafter conducted small groups to the north under extreme secrecy. She claimed she had never lost a passenger in her journeys north. She is credited with 13 missions that rescued approximately 70 enslaved people. During the American Civil War, Harriet Tubman worked as a scout and a spy for the Union Army, and later in the century she worked as an activist for women's suffrage. The political debate over slavery that was shelved at the time of the Constitutional Convention became the issue that would not go away increasingly over the antebellum period. Although many Americans wanted to move forward as a nation, Southerners were determined to defend the slave institution, and a growing body in the North was determined to see to its abolition. The sides and debates became hardened during the antebellum period, making debate increasingly contentious on the personal, local, state, and national levels. In an effort to avoid the issue altogether, the House of Representatives passed a gag rule that was in effect between 1836 and 1844. The gag rule prevented the reading, consideration, or voting on of anti-slavery petitions to the House of Representatives. The measure was a troubling symbol in a republic that prided itself on parliamentary debate, free speech, and the freedom of all men. Those core founding principles certainly could not be reconciled with a measure passed by the democratically elected House of Representatives that refused to hear petitions regarding the emancipation of U.S. citizens. Those core founding principles certainly could not be reconciled with a measure passed by the democratically elected House of Representatives that refused to hear petitions regarding the emancipation of slaves. Former President John Quincy Adams drafted the resolution that finally terminated the gag rule in the House in 1844. As the two primary political parties of the antebellum period, the Democrats and Whigs, continued to bicker and obfuscate on the slave issue, two new political parties developed in the antebellum period designed to make the slave issue the issue in national politics. The Liberty Party was an abolitionist party that enjoyed most of its support during the 1840s. The Liberty Party ran James G. Birney as their presidential candidate in both the 1840 and 1844 elections. The party endeavored to work within the federal system and the United States Constitution to diminish the political power of the slave power. The party also sought to advance the cause of universal emancipation and an integrated egalitarian society. The party enjoyed only marginal success and never really came close to capturing the presidency, and so its members gradually faded away and often joined the Free Soil Party. The Free Soil Party picked up where the Liberty Party dropped off and nominated candidates for the presidency in 1848 and 1852. The Free Soil's primary issue was blocking the further expansion of slavery into the territories. The party was particularly motivated after the Mexican-American War and the purchase of the Mexican Cession. Former President Martin Van Buren was the Free Soil Party's nominee in 1848. The passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act that ended the Missouri Compromise, however, was a true flashpoint in the nation's debate over slavery. With the possibility of vast tracts of land now being open for settlement and slavery, a need arose for a much broader political party that would unify slave opposition in the North. The Liberty Party and Free Soil Party both declined in membership once the Republican Party was formed in the 1850s. By the 1850s, the great reform movements of the antebellum period had largely declined, and reformers in the North came to focus almost exclusively on the abolition of slavery. With all other movements, organizations, societies, and parties failing to achieve the goal of abolition, many in the North came to look at the national government as the only organ by which slavery could be abolished. And if that national government needed to abolish slavery by conducting war against the southern portion of the United States, passions were so inflamed by the 1850s that many in the North were willing to support such a violent endeavor. Thus, the great age of reform during the antebellum period came to a violent and bloody end in the 1860s on the battlefields of the American Civil War.